The chain rattled against the frozen ground as Max rose to his full height, ears forward, every muscle tense beneath his matted fur. Through the darkness, his amber eyes locked onto the two shadowy figures working at the back door of the Hargrove home. 5 years of neglect had weakened his body, ribs visible through his once lustrous coat, raw skin circling his neck where the metal collar had rubbed away fur. But nothing had diminished his loyalty. The taller intruder tossed something toward him. The scent of drugged meat reached his nostrils. "Eat up, mutt," the man whispered. "Nobody's coming to help you." Max had a choice. The family that had chained him to this stake and forgotten him was away. No one would know if he simply stayed silent, took the poisoned offering. Instead, Max threw back his head and unleashed a thunderous bark that shattered the Montana night. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Hargrove property sat isolated on the outskirts of Clearwater County, Montana, a weathered 2-story farmhouse perched on 5 acres of land that had once held promise but now lay neglected like everything else the family owned. 30 miles from Bozeman, their nearest neighbor was Meredith Wilson, a widow whose property line began where the scraggly pines at the edge of the Hargrove land ended. In summer, wildflowers dotted the meadows surrounding the house, but for 8 months of the year, Montana's harsh weather transformed the landscape into an unforgiving wasteland of snow, ice, and bitter cold. It was during these months that Max's existence became truly miserable. Wyatt Hargrove had once been the foreman at the Henderson Construction Company before the economic downturn cost him his job 5 years ago. At 45, with calloused hands and a face weathered by outdoor work, he'd grown increasingly bitter watching his savings dwindle while taking whatever odd jobs came his way. The bottle became his solace, his temper shortening with each passing month of financial strain. Charlotte, his wife of 17 years, worked double shifts at the Silver Spoon Diner. Her once vibrant personality faded like the worn uniform she donned 6 days a week. At 42, the constant worry had etched permanent lines around her eyes. She moved carefully in Wyatt's presence, as if walking on glass, her voice rarely rising above a whisper in their home. Their daughter Lily, now 15, was a quiet girl with her mother's gentle features and an artistic talent that flourished in the sketchbooks she kept hidden under her mattress. Many of those sketches featured Max, the family's German shepherd, captured in poses of dignity despite his circumstances. Max's world was defined by the circumference of his chain, 10 feet in diameter with a metal stake driven into the hard Montana soil. His shelter was a splintering doghouse, too small for his full frame, forcing him to curl tightly during snowstorms and summer downpours alike. His water often froze solid in winter. In summer, it evaporated under the relentless sun. From his position near the back of the house, Max could observe the family through the kitchen window, watching their lives unfold while remaining forever separate, a guardian sentenced to solitude for crimes he never committed. 7 years earlier, Max had arrived at the Hargrove home in the back of Wyatt's pickup truck, a 2-year-old German shepherd with alert eyes and a powerful build. Lily, then only 8, had squealed with delight as her father lifted the dog down from the truck bed. "Is he really ours, Daddy?" she had asked, her small hand reaching out cautiously toward Max's glossy coat. "Sure is, sweetheart," Wyatt had answered, a genuine smile spreading across his face, the kind of smile that had become increasingly rare in recent years. "Got him from a buddy who trains dogs for special work. Max here was in training to be a police dog, but he injured his leg and couldn't complete the program. Their loss is our gain." Charlotte had emerged from the house, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her expression a mixture of surprise and concern. "Wyatt, we never discussed getting a dog." "He's a bargain, Charlotte. Already house-trained and knows commands." Plus, he'll be good protection out here so far from town. Wyatt had patted Max's head proudly. He'll earn his keep. In those early days, Max had slept in the mud room on a thick bed Charlotte had sewn from old blankets. He ate proper dog food from a ceramic bowl with his name painted on it, a weekend project Lily had completed with painstaking care. Wyatt had even built a sturdy doghouse, placing it near the back porch where Max could come and go as he pleased during the day. The first winter, Max had proven his worth when he'd alerted the family to a gas leak in the middle of the night, barking persistently until Wyatt woke to investigate. "That dog probably saved our lives," he'd admitted the next morning over breakfast. But everything changed during the spring thaw when 10-year-old Lily had wandered too close to the swollen creek that cut through the edge of their property. The ice, thinning under the warming sun, had cracked beneath her feet, plunging her into the frigid water. Max, who had been exploring nearby, heard her screams. Without hesitation, he'd leaped into the churning water, swimming powerfully against the current to reach the terrified child. Grabbing her jacket in his strong jaws, he had dragged her toward the shore where Charlotte, alerted by the commotion, stood frozen in horror. That night, Max had been treated like a hero. Wrapped in warm blankets beside the fireplace, he'd received gentle pats and tearful thanks from Charlotte, extra treats from Lily, and even a rare display of affection from Wyatt, who had sat beside him long into the night, one hand resting on Max's damp fur. "Never had a dog growing up," Wyatt had confessed quietly. "My father didn't believe in pets, said they were just another mouth to feed." He had gazed into the dying embers of the fire. "But you're something special, aren't you, boy?" 2 weeks later, Wyatt lost his job. The change wasn't immediate. First came the longer hours away from home as Wyatt searched for new employment. Then the increasingly frequent smell of whiskey on his breath when he returned. The shouting matches with Charlotte after Lily had gone to bed. The mornings when he couldn't get out of bed, leaving Charlotte to call in yet another excuse to potential employers. Max was the first to feel the shift. His food changed from quality kibble to table scraps, then to whatever was cheapest at the store, and finally to whatever the family didn't finish, often nothing more than soggy cereal or stale bread. His regular walks with Wyatt ceased entirely. The chain appeared 6 months after Wyatt lost his job, on a day when he'd returned home particularly late and reeking of alcohol. "Damn dog knocked over the trash again," he'd muttered, pulling the heavy chain from the bed of his truck. "This'll keep him where he belongs." Charlotte had protested weakly. "Wyatt, he's a good dog. He just needs more attention." "What he needs is discipline," Wyatt had snapped, his words slightly slurred. "Can't afford dog food, can't afford him destroying what little we have." Max had stood still, confused but obedient, as Wyatt fastened the heavy collar around his neck and attached it to the chain, which he secured to a metal stake hammered deep into the ground near the doghouse. "There," Wyatt had declared, stepping back to survey his work. "Now he can still do his job, bark if anyone comes around, without getting into trouble." That night was the first Max spent outside, the unfamiliar weight of the chain preventing him from finding comfort in his doghouse. He had whined softly, looking toward the darkened house, unable to understand what he had done wrong. Lily had sneaked out before dawn, her eyes red from crying, to sit beside him and wrap her thin arms around his neck. "I'm sorry, Max," she had whispered. "Daddy says it's just temporary, until things get better." But things hadn't gotten better. Weeks turned into months, and months into years. The chain became Max's permanent tether to a family that gradually retreated from him. Wyatt referred to him as the alarm system rather than by name. Charlotte, increasingly worn down by financial worries and Wyatt's volatile moods, could only offer occasional scraps and furtive pats when her husband wasn't looking. Only Lily remained steadfast in her affection, though her visits became more secretive as Wyatt's temper worsened. The gleaming coat that had once been Max's pride grew dull and matted. The powerful muscles that had pulled Lily from the creek weakened from lack of exercise and proper nutrition. The doghouse, once a shelter from the elements, deteriorated without maintenance, its roof leaking during rainstorms, its walls offering little protection against Montana's brutal winters. Yet through it all, Max remained vigilant. Each day he watched over the property from his limited vantage point. Each night he listened for unusual sounds that might signal danger to the family inside the house. And when strangers approached, he barked his warning, fulfilling the only purpose Wyatt still valued him for. The Montana winter had been particularly brutal that year, with temperatures plummeting to 20 below zero for weeks on end. By February, Max's condition had deteriorated noticeably. His once powerful frame had grown gaunt, ribs visible beneath his dull coat. A persistent cough rattled his chest during cold nights, and he moved with a stiffness that spoke of joint pain and age beyond his 7 years. Lily noticed it first, her artist's eye catching the subtle changes in his posture, the way he favored his right front paw, the increasing periods he spent huddled in the inadequate shelter of his doghouse rather than maintaining his usual alert watch. "Mom," she whispered one morning as they prepared breakfast, carefully timing her words for when Wyatt was in the shower. "Something's wrong with Max. He's sick." Charlotte glanced anxiously toward the bathroom door before looking out the kitchen window at the dog. Even from a distance, she could see what her daughter meant. The proud German shepherd sat hunched against the morning cold, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "I know, honey," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the sound of running water. "But your father won't spend money on vet bills, not now." "He could die out there," Lily pressed, tears welling in her eyes. "He saved my life, Mom." Charlotte's hands stilled on the pancake batter she was mixing. That day at the creek had never left her mind. The terror of seeing her daughter in the icy water, the relief when Max had pulled her to safety. She looked again at the loyal dog who had asked for so little and received even less. "I'll figure something out," she promised. "Don't say anything to your father." That afternoon, while Wyatt was out looking for work, Charlotte called the only veterinarian in Clearwater County, Dr. Simmons. The price quote for even a basic examination made her stomach sink. There was simply no way to hide such an expense from Wyatt, who scrutinized every receipt and questioned every dollar spent. As she hung up the phone, a knock at the front door startled her. Opening it, she found Meredith Wilson standing on the porch, a casserole dish in her gloved hands. "Thought you might appreciate a home-cooked meal," the older woman said, her sharp eyes taking in Charlotte's worn appearance. "Saw your husband drive off earlier. Figured you might have a moment to chat." At 68, Meredith was a fixture in the rural community, having lived on her property for over 40 years. Her silver hair was always neatly styled, her clothes practical but well-maintained. Widowed for a decade, she kept largely to herself, though Charlotte had occasionally spotted her watching their property through binoculars from her porch. "Bird watching," Meredith had explained once when Charlotte mentioned it. Charlotte hesitated only briefly before inviting her neighbor inside. And they had never been close, but there was something in Meredith's direct gaze that suggested understanding rather than judgment. Over coffee at the kitchen table, with the casserole warming in the oven, Meredith finally broached the subject Charlotte had been avoiding. "That dog of yours doesn't look well," she stated plainly, stirring a spoonful of sugar into her cup. "Been watching him struggle through this cold snap." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for too long. "I know. We can't afford a vet. And Wyatt, he doesn't see Max as part of the family anymore." Meredith set down her spoon with deliberate precision. "I was a veterinarian for 35 years before I retired," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "Haven't practiced officially in a decade, but I still know my way around an animal's ailments." Charlotte stared at her, hope and disbelief mingling. You were a vet." "I had no idea. Most folks around here don't know much about me, and I prefer it that way." Meredith's weathered face softened slightly. "But I've been watching that shepherd of yours since Wyatt chained him up 5 years ago. Never sat right with me." "You've been watching us?" Charlotte asked, a note of defensiveness creeping into her voice. "Not you, dear. The dog." Meredith sipped her coffee calmly. "And occasionally your husband, when his shouting carries across the property line." A flush of shame colored Charlotte's cheeks. "Things have been difficult since Wyatt lost his job." "Difficult times don't justify cruelty," Meredith replied, then added more gently, "to animals or to people." Their eyes met in a moment of silent understanding before Meredith continued. "I can take a look at your Max. Have some medications left from when I treated my own animals. No charge, of course." "Wyatt can't know," Charlotte whispered. "He'd be furious if I spent money or accepted charity." "Then we won't tell him," Meredith said simply. "I'll come by tomorrow when he's out. Your daughter, Lily, isn't it? She can help hold Max while I examine him." The next day, true to her word, Meredith arrived carrying an old leather medical bag. Lily, who had stayed home from school with a fabricated headache, led the older woman to where Max was tethered. Max growled low in his throat as the stranger approached, his protective instincts still strong despite his weakened state. "It's okay, Max," Lily soothed, kneeling beside him. "She's here to help." Meredith moved with the confident efficiency of someone who had handled countless animals. Her examination was thorough but gentle, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she checked Max's lungs, joints, and the raw skin around his neck where the heavy collar had rubbed away fur. "Pneumonia," she diagnosed, packing stethoscope back into her bag. "Malnutrition?" "Exposure. Likely arthritis setting in early due to the constant cold and damp." She produced several bottles of medication from her bag. Antibiotics for the infection, pain relievers for his joints, a vitamin supplement to help with the malnutrition. She demonstrated how to hide the pills in small bits of meat, explaining the dosages to Charlotte and Lily. Then, unexpectedly, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a worn leather collar with tarnished metal tags. "Found this caught on my fence line a few years back," she said, handing it to Lily. "Never knew where it came from until I saw your Max." Lily turned the collar over in her hands, examining the tags. Her eyes widened. "K9 unit," she read aloud. "Max number 457, Montana State Police." She looked up at Meredith in confusion. "This was Max's?" Meredith nodded. "Your father's story about Max washing out of police training wasn't entirely accurate. According to those tags, he was a full-fledged police dog. Must have been retired, maybe after an injury." She glanced at Max with newfound respect. "Explains his training, his intelligence. These dogs are special, bred and trained for service." Lily clutched the collar to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "He was a hero before he even saved me," she whispered. "And he's still trying to be one," Meredith observed, watching as Max, despite his illness, maintained his vigilant gaze on the surrounding property. "Even after all this, he's still protecting you." Max's days followed a pattern as predictable as the path worn into the dirt around his stake. Each morning began with the slam of the screen door as Wyatt left for whatever temporary work he'd managed to find. The man rarely acknowledged Max anymore, occasionally muttering, "Guard the place, dog," as he passed, the closest thing to communication between them. After Wyatt's departure, Charlotte would sometimes emerge with scraps wrapped in a paper napkin, ends of toast perhaps, or remnants of scrambled eggs, quickly tossed within Max's reach before hurrying back inside. On good days, she might whisper, "I'm sorry, Max." But most mornings, guilt kept her eyes averted from his hopeful gaze. The revelations about Max's past as a police dog had deepened Lily's already fierce devotion. Each afternoon after school, she would sit beside him, careful to position herself where she couldn't be seen from the road, where her father might spot her on his return home. "You were a hero," she would tell him, administering the medications Meredith had provided with practiced hands. "You still are." In her backpack, Lily carried a sketchbook filled with drawings of Max, not as he appeared now, thin and weathered, but as she imagined him in his prime, strong, proud, working alongside police officers. She would show him these drawings, describing the adventures she'd invented for his younger self. "You probably caught lots of bad guys," she said one afternoon, her breath visible in the cold air as she stroked his coarse fur. "Dad doesn't understand what you are, what you're worth." Max listened to these one-sided conversations with attentive eyes, his tail offering a weak wag despite the persistent pain in his joints. The antibiotics Meredith had provided had helped with his pneumonia, but the exposure to Montana's elements continued to wear on his aging body. From his position near the back of the house, Max observed the family dynamics through the kitchen window, a silent witness to the disintegration of what had once been a loving home. He watched Wyatt's increasing absences, the way Charlotte flinched when her husband moved too quickly, the growing silence that filled the spaces where conversation had once flowed. On particularly cold nights, Max would sometimes catch glimpses of Lily standing at her bedroom window, looking down at him, her palm pressed against the glass in a gesture of connection across the distance that separated them. During these moments, his ears would perk up, his posture momentarily reclaiming some of its former dignity. At the neighboring property, Meredith Wilson maintained her quiet vigilance. Twice a week, she would walk the perimeter of her land, binoculars hanging around her neck, ostensibly checking her fence line, but always pausing at the point nearest to Max's stake. She kept meticulous notes in a small leather-bound journal, observations of Max's condition, Wyatt's comings and goings, the occasions when Charlotte sported concealer that didn't quite hide the discoloration around her eye. Meredith had considered calling the authorities several times over the years, about the dog, about the shouting she sometimes heard, about the occasional sound of breaking glass. But in rural Montana, where properties were spread far apart and privacy was almost sacred, such interventions rarely ended well. The local sheriff was a hunting buddy of Wyatt's, and previous complaints about animal welfare in the county had resulted in little action. Instead, she continued her covert support, leaving supplies for Max with Charlotte when Wyatt was away, offering a sympathetic ear when the younger woman seemed in need of connection. "My Harold wasn't always kind either," she confided to Charlotte one afternoon over coffee. Especially after the bottle became his closest friend. Charlotte's hands tightened around her mug. "Did it ever get better?" Meredith's weathered face softened with memory. "It did, eventually. Hit rock bottom and found his way back up. But I had to be ready to leave before he was ready to change." She reached across the table to cover Charlotte's hand with her own. "You have options, dear. You and Lily both." Charlotte withdrew her hand gently. "Not as many as you might think. No family to turn to, no savings of my own. The diner barely pays enough for groceries. There are women's shelters in Bozeman," Meredith suggested carefully. "And go where after? Do what?" Charlotte shook her head. "Besides, he's never hurt Lily. It's just me he gets frustrated with, and Max." Meredith didn't push further, recognizing the familiar pattern of rationalization and fear. Instead, she changed the subject. "Max is responding well to the antibiotics. His breathing sounds better." "Lily says he seems stronger," Charlotte agreed. "She's been sneaking him extra food from her school lunches." A small smile touched her lips. "That girl loves that dog more than anything." "Dogs have a way of earning that kind of devotion," Meredith observed. "They love unconditionally, protect instinctively. Max would die for your daughter without hesitation, even after years of neglect. There's a lesson in that kind of loyalty." Charlotte's eyes drifted to the window where she could just make out Max's form in the distance. "Yes," she said quietly. "I suppose there is." Winter gradually released its grip on the Montana landscape, snow giving way to mud and eventually to the first tentative green shoots of spring. Max's health improved somewhat with the milder weather and the continued secret care from Lily and Meredith, though years of neglect had left permanent marks on his once powerful body. As April arrived, bringing unpredictable bursts of warmth between lingering cold fronts, the Hargrove household faced a new crisis. Wyatt, who had been working sporadic construction jobs through a temporary agency, came home one evening with a thunderous expression and alcohol heavy on his breath. "They're shutting down the Henderson project," he announced, slamming his keys onto the kitchen counter. "Budget cuts. No more work for at least 2 months." Charlotte, who had been preparing a simple dinner of pasta with canned sauce, kept her eyes on the boiling pot. "I can pick up extra shifts at the diner," she offered cautiously. "Barely making ends meet as it is," Wyatt muttered, opening the refrigerator and grabbing a beer, one of the few luxuries he refused to sacrifice despite their financial situation. "Mortgage is already 2 months behind." From her seat at the kitchen table where she had been doing homework, Lily ventured a tentative suggestion. "Maybe I could get a weekend job. The general store might—" "You're 15, Wyatt cut her off. "Focus on school." Despite his harsh tone, a flash of the father he had once been showed through, the man who had valued education and opportunities for his daughter. The moment passed quickly as his gaze drifted to the window, landing on Max, who sat alert near his steak, watching a delivery truck pass on the distant road. "Might have to sell that dog," Wyatt said suddenly. "Shepherds are worth good money, even older ones." "No!" Lily's voice rose in rare defiance. "You can't sell Max!" Wyatt turned to her, surprise at her outburst momentarily overriding his anger. "He's just a dog, Lily, an expense we can't afford right now. He saved my life." Tears spilled down Lily's cheeks. "You always say we pay our debts, Dad. We owe him." Charlotte moved to stand behind her daughter, a protective hand on her shoulder. "Lily's right, Wyatt. Max has been loyal to this family. We can find other ways to cut expenses." For a tense moment, Wyatt's face darkened and Charlotte's fingers tightened on Lily's shoulder. Then, unexpectedly, he seemed to deflate, sinking into a kitchen chair and running a hand over his face. "Fine," he said, his voice suddenly tired. "But no more sneaking food out to him, Lily. I've seen you. He eats scraps, nothing more. We can't afford dog food when we can barely feed ourselves." Lily nodded quickly, relief evident in her expression, though she avoided meeting her mother's eyes, both of them aware of the medications and supplements still hidden in Lily's room, of Meredith's continued assistance that Wyatt knew nothing about. The threat of selling Max temporarily averted, life continued its uneasy rhythm at the Hargrove property. Wyatt spent more time at home, his presence creating a constant tension that affected everyone, including Max, who seemed to sense the heightened stress inside the house. The German shepherd became more vigilant, more alert to Wyatt's movements, his ears tracking the man's heavy footsteps through the house. One evening in late April, as a spring storm rolled across the mountains, bringing sheets of cold rain and the occasional rumble of thunder, Wyatt received a phone call that changed his demeanor entirely. He took the call in the living room, his voice too low for Charlotte or Lily to make out the words from the kitchen. When he returned, there was an unfamiliar energy about him, an almost feverish gleam in his eyes. "That was Jimmy," he announced, referring to his older brother, whom neither Charlotte nor Lily had seen in nearly 3 years. James Hargrove had a complicated history that included several stints in prison for theft and fraud, and Charlotte had always been uncomfortable with his influence over Wyatt. "He's coming through town tomorrow," Wyatt continued. "Got a lead on a job down in Idaho, construction for a new resort. Good money, steady work for at least a year." "That's wonderful," Charlotte said carefully, trying to match his enthusiasm while tamping down her skepticism. James's opportunities had rarely panned out positively in the past. "He wants to meet, talk about details." Wyatt's expression brightened further. "And your sister called earlier, said we could use her cabin this weekend if we wanted. Maybe we should go, Charlotte. Make a family trip of it. Been too long since we did something together." The sudden shift from financial desperation to optimistic planning set alarm bells ringing in Charlotte's mind, but she was reluctant to dampen the first positive mood Wyatt had shown in months. "That would be nice," she agreed tentatively. "But what about Max? We can't leave him alone for a whole weekend." Wyatt waved a dismissive hand. "Dog's been alone plenty of times when we've gone out. Leave him extra water, he'll be fine." "There's a storm coming," Lily protested. "They're saying it could be the biggest of the season. He needs proper shelter. His doghouse is falling apart." "Enough about the damn dog!" Wyatt's flash of good humor evaporated. "Either we all go, or no one goes. I'm trying to do something nice for this family." The argument that followed was subdued but intense, conducted in harsh whispers after Lily had gone reluctantly to bed. Charlotte, worried about Max, but also sensing an opportunity in the rare family outing, eventually reached a compromise. They would go for just one night instead of the entire weekend, leaving Saturday morning and returning Sunday afternoon. She would ask Meredith to check on Max discreetly, ensuring he had water and some form of additional shelter if the storm worsened. Wyatt agreed with surprising ease, his thoughts seemingly elsewhere, that strange energy still animating his movements as he packed a small bag for the trip. Charlotte, watching him from the bedroom doorway, felt a prickle of unease. In 15 years of marriage, she had learned to read the subtle shifts in his demeanor, and something about his current mood struck her as off, not quite genuine, somehow performative. When she mentioned calling Meredith about checking on Max, Wyatt's response was unexpectedly positive. "Good idea," he said, not looking up from his packing. "That old lady's always watching our place anyway. Might as well make herself useful." The casual acknowledgement of Meredith's surveillance surprised Charlotte, who had thought Wyatt unaware of their neighbor's attentive eye. She made a mental note to warn Meredith to be especially careful during her visits to Max while they were away. Saturday morning dawned clear but cold, with heavy clouds building on the western horizon, the promised storm gathering strength. Lily emerged from her room with red-rimmed eyes, having spent much of the night worrying about leaving Max alone in the approaching weather. Before getting into the car, she knelt beside him, whispering reassurances and slipping him a piece of beef jerky she'd saved from her lunch the previous day. "Meredith will check on you," she promised, her voice breaking slightly. "And we'll be back tomorrow. Just one night." Max watched with attentive eyes as the family loaded into their aging sedan. Something about the departure felt different from the usual daily routines, perhaps the overnight bags visible through the car windows, or the unusual tension in the humans' movements. As the car backed down the long driveway, Max rose to his feet, straining against his chain as far as it would allow, his bark following them until they turned onto the main road and disappeared from view. At the edge of her property, Meredith Wilson stood on her porch, binoculars raised, watching the Hargrove car leave. The unexpected family trip had triggered her suspicions, especially given the approaching storm and Wyatt's recent financial troubles. She had agreed to Charlotte's request to check on Max, planning to bring him extra food and a tarp to reinforce his dilapidated shelter against the coming rain. What neither woman knew was that as the Hargroves drove east toward Charlotte's sister's cabin, James Hargrove was already in town, sitting in a motel room 20 miles away with a man named Ray Caldwell, studying a hand-drawn layout of the Hargrove house and property. "The dog's the only problem," James was saying, tapping a thick finger on the crude map. "German Shepherd, old but still alert. Wyatt says he barks at everything." Ray, a heavy-set man with small, clever eyes, shrugged. "Got something for that. dogs love hamburger, even with a little something extra in it. He patted a small bottle in his jacket pocket. Won't hurt it, just make it sleep through our visit. James nodded approvingly. Wyatt said they'll be gone until tomorrow afternoon. Should give us plenty of time. Still don't get why your brother's helping us rob his own house, Ray commented, reaching for his beer. Seems messed up, even for you, Jimmy. James Hargrove's smile didn't reach his eyes. Insurance scam. House is worth more broken into than standing empty. He gets the insurance payout, we get the valuables, everybody wins. He didn't mention the gambling debts that had driven him to propose the scheme to his desperate younger brother, or the fact that Wyatt believed they would only take specific items while leaving more sentimental valuables untouched. A promise James had no intention of keeping. What about the wife and kid? Ray asked. They in on it too? Nah, James replied, draining his beer. Wyatt doesn't trust them to keep the story straight. Better they don't know, more convincing for the insurance company. He checked his watch. They should be at the cabin by now. We'll go in after midnight when the neighbors are asleep. In and out, clean job. Back at the Hargrove property, the promised storm arrived with unexpected ferocity. By late afternoon, rain lashed against Max's doghouse, finding every crack in the deteriorating structure. Wind drove the water horizontally, leaving no corner of his small shelter dry. Thunder boomed across the valley, each crash causing Max to flinch, his body trembling not from fear, but from the bone-deep cold of the rain soaking through his coat. At 6 o'clock, as darkness fell early under the storm clouds, Meredith Wilson pulled her old truck as close to the Hargrove property line as possible. Dressed in a heavy raincoat and boots, she made her way carefully across the muddy ground, carrying a tarp, rope, and a container of beef stew she'd prepared for Max. The German shepherd's initial bark of warning turned to a whine of recognition as Meredith approached, her familiar scent reaching him through the rain. Poor boy, she murmured, surveying his sodden form and the puddles forming inside his doghouse. Let's get you some proper shelter. With efficient movements belying her age, Meredith secured the tarp over and around the doghouse, creating a waterproof barrier that extended several feet beyond the structure, offering Max additional dry space. She fed him the still warm stew, watching with satisfaction as he ate eagerly, then administered the medication she'd brought in her pocket. That should help with the pain, she told him, running a practiced hand over his joints, assessing his condition. The pneumonia had improved, but the cold and damp were clearly aggravating his arthritis. I'd take you home with me if I could, but your family would notice and we can't have that just yet. Max leaned against her hand, seeking the warmth of human contact. Meredith sat with him longer than she'd planned, providing the companionship he so rarely received. The storm continued unabated, but beneath the improvised shelter, Max was at least dry, fed, and temporarily comforted. I'll come back in the morning, Meredith promised as she finally rose to leave. Try to rest those old bones, officer. The title, a nod to his former service, was delivered with genuine respect. As she made her way back to her truck, fighting against the wind and rain, Meredith failed to notice the pair of headlights that briefly illuminated the main road before turning off, the vehicle continuing its approach with only parking lights offering minimal illumination. Inside that vehicle, James Hargrove peered through the rain-streaked windshield, cursing under his breath. Some old lady just left the property, he reported to Ray, who sat tensely in the passenger seat. Probably that nosy neighbor Wyatt mentioned. We should wait, Ray suggested. Make sure she doesn't come back. James checked his watch impatiently. It's already past 9. If we wait too long, we risk running into early risers tomorrow. The storm works in our favor, covers noise, keeps people indoors. He pulled the truck further off the road, concealing it behind a stand of pine trees. We'll give it another hour, then go in. Dog first, then the house. As midnight approached, the storm reached its peak intensity. Rain hammered against the tarp Meredith had installed, the sound a constant roar that made it difficult for Max to distinguish other noises. Despite his age and the pain in his joints, his senses remained sharp, the legacy of his police training. When the unfamiliar truck approached slowly down the driveway, lights off, engine barely above idle, Max was instantly alert. His initial bark was carried away by the wind, barely audible even to his own ears. He tried again, louder this time, but the storm's fury seemed determined to swallow his warnings. As two figures emerged from the vehicle, moving with furtive purpose toward the house, Max's protective instincts surged through his aging body. The chain around his neck suddenly felt heavier than ever, a cruel restraint keeping him from fulfilling his most basic purpose, protecting his territory, his home, his family. The men approached cautiously, flashlight beams sweeping the yard until they located Max. Even through the rain, he could smell their nervous sweat, the unfamiliar scents clinging to their clothes, the wrongness of their presence on his property. "There's the dog," James muttered, pointing toward the improvised shelter where Max stood at full attention, a low growl rumbling from deep in his chest. "Take care of him first." Ray nodded, pulling a small package from his pocket, a hamburger patty infused with a powerful sedative. He approached the perimeter of Max's chain range, calculating the distance before tossing the meat toward the dog. "Here you go, boy," he called in a falsely friendly tone. "Something special for you." The meat landed just within Max's reach, its rich scent cutting through even the smell of rain and wet earth. For a moment, hunger nearly overwhelmed his training. It had been so long since he'd tasted real meat, aside from the small treats Lily smuggled to him. He took a step toward the offering, nose twitching. Then something, perhaps a remnant of his police training or simply the wrongness of the situation, made him hesitate. The meat smelled off, tainted with a chemical odor his sensitive nose detected beneath the beef. Max backed away, his growl deepening into a series of sharp, warning barks that he projected with all his remaining strength, fighting to be heard above the storm. "Damn it," Ray hissed. "He won't take it." James shrugged impatiently. "Forget the dog. Chain's too short for him to reach us at the house. Let him bark. No one's going to hear anything in this storm." But Max was determined to be heard. As the men moved toward the back door of the house, he threw his entire body against the chain, ignoring the pain as the metal collar cut into the already raw skin of his neck. His barking took on a frantic quality, not his usual alert to passing cars or delivery trucks, but an urgent, continuous alarm that spoke of immediate danger. At the edge of the property, Meredith Wilson, who had been unable to sleep worrying about Max in the storm, sat in her darkened living room. Through her window, despite the rain and darkness, she could just make out the Hargrove property and the unusual flashlight beams moving around the house. "Something's not right," she murmured to herself, reaching for the phone to call the sheriff's office. The back door of the Hargrove home yielded easily to James's practiced touch, the aging lock no match for his slim metal tools. As the door swung open, the familiar scent of his brother's house brought an unexpected twinge of guilt, quickly suppressed as Ray pushed past him into the darkened kitchen. 15 minutes, James whispered, checking his watch. "Grab the electronics, jewelry, cash. I'll check the master bedroom for the gun safe." Outside, Max's barking had escalated to a desperate frenzy. The German shepherd hurled himself against his chain repeatedly, each lunge reopening the wounds around his neck, drops of blood mingling with rain on his matted fur. The physical pain registered dimly compared to his overwhelming need to protect the house, to fulfill the purpose that had sustained him through years of neglect. Through the kitchen window, he could see the intruder's flashlight beams dancing across the walls, illuminating familiar photographs. Lily's school portrait, a faded wedding picture of Charlotte and Wyatt in happier times. These images, which Max had observed daily from his tethered position, represented the family he still considered his own, despite everything. At the neighboring property, Meredith Wilson had called the sheriff's office, reporting suspicious activity at the Hargrove place. The dispatcher's response had been predictably measured. "The family's out of town until tomorrow, Mrs. Wilson. Probably just the storm playing tricks with the light." "I know what I'm seeing," Meredith insisted, her voice sharp with urgency. "There are people in that house with flashlights, and they didn't drive up in the Hargroves' car, and their dog is barking like I've never heard before." The mention of unusual barking seemed to give the dispatcher pause. "Sheriff Thompson is out on another call, tree down on Highway 14. I can send Deputy Ramirez, but it'll take him at least 20 minutes to get out there from town." "Send him," Meredith said firmly, "and tell him to hurry." Setting down the phone, she moved to her hall closet, retrieving an old shotgun that had belonged to her late husband. Loading it with practiced hands, she glanced out the window once more at Max's distant form, still visible as a blur of movement in the stormy darkness. The dog's desperate barking carried faintly through the rain-lashed night, spurring her to action. "Too old for this nonsense," she muttered to herself, pulling on a raincoat and grabbing a powerful flashlight. At 68, with arthritic knees and a heart condition, confronting potential burglars was the last thing she should be doing. But the thought of Max fighting so valiantly, alone and restrained, while thieves ransacked his family's home, propelled her forward. Inside the Hargrove house, James had located Wyatt's gun safe in the master bedroom closet. He knelt before it, fingers working the combination he'd memorized after watching his brother open it months earlier during a rare family visit. "Jackpot," he whispered as the door swung open, revealing not only Wyatt's hunting rifles, but also a small cash box containing the emergency fund Charlotte had painstakingly built from years of tip money, nearly $2,000 she'd hidden from her husband's knowledge. Downstairs, Ray worked methodically through the living room, disconnecting the television and sound system, gathering Charlotte's modest jewelry from the bathroom, and stuffing Lily's laptop into his bag. The job was proceeding smoothly despite Max's continued barking outside, which seemed to be growing more desperate by the minute. "Hey, Jimmy," Ray called softly up the stairs. "We should move faster." "That dog's going nuts out there. No one's going to hear him in this storm," James replied, descending with the cash box and a small collection of valuables. "Besides, closest neighbor is that old lady, and she's got to be deaf as a post by now." As if to mock his confidence, a powerful flashlight beam suddenly cut through the front window, illuminating the living room where they stood. Both men froze as the beam settled on Ray's face, momentarily blinding him. "Police! I've called the sheriff!" Meredith's voice, magnified by determination and anger, carried clearly through the storm. "Come out with your hands up." "Shit," James hissed, ducking low. "It's that nosy neighbor. Is she alone?" Ray peered cautiously around the curtain. "Looks like it. Just an old lady with a flashlight. But she's got something else. Might be a gun." James swore under his breath. "We need to get out the back door." "Grab what you can carry." Outside, Max had registered Meredith's arrival with renewed vigor. His barking changed pitch, communicating not just alarm, but recognition of a potential ally. He strained toward her voice, feeling the stake securing his chain shift slightly in the rain-softened ground, the first movement it had shown in 5 years of confinement. Meredith stood her ground at the edge of the front yard, shotgun held steadily despite the rain pelting her face. Her truck was parked at the foot of the driveway, its headlights providing additional illumination to the scene. The plan she'd hastily formed while driving over had been simple: create the impression of police presence, make noise, and hope the burglars would flee rather than confront her. So far, there was no movement from inside the house. "I know you're in there," she called again, her voice betraying none of the fear coursing through her. "Sheriff's deputies are 2 minutes away." Inside, James and Ray had gathered their bags of stolen items and were moving toward the kitchen and the back door. James's expression had hardened from concern to anger. What should have been a simple job was now complicated by an elderly neighbor playing hero. "We'll circle around through the back," he whispered to Ray. "Get to the truck the long way. If she tries to stop us." He patted his jacket pocket meaningfully where the outline of a handgun was barely visible. Ray's eyes widened. "You didn't say anything about guns, man. I didn't sign up for shooting some old lady." "Just insurance," James assured him, though his expression suggested otherwise. "Come on." They slipped out the back door into the storm, keeping low as they circled the side of the house opposite from where Meredith stood. The rain provided perfect cover, reducing visibility to mere feet and muffling their footsteps in the sodden grass. What they hadn't accounted for was Max's position. As they emerged from the house, they came directly into his line of sight. The German shepherd's barking reached a new intensity, drawing Meredith's attention to the movement at the side of the house. "Stop right there!" she shouted, swinging her flashlight and shotgun toward the figures. James reacted instinctively, reaching for his weapon. In the confusion of rain and darkness, he misjudged the elderly woman's position and capabilities. The shotgun in Meredith's hands may have been decades old, but she handled it with the confidence of someone who had grown up in rural Montana, where shooting was as fundamental as driving. "Don't do it, young man," she warned, her voice steady despite the rain streaming down her face. "This old Remington doesn't care how fast you are." James hesitated, calculating his options. Ray had already dropped his bag, hands raised in surrender, clearly unwilling to escalate the situation. But James had more at stake: outstanding warrants, a third-strike felony if caught, the gambling debts that would result in far worse than jail if left unpaid. "You don't want to do this," he said, taking a step toward Meredith, his hand still hovering near his jacket. "Just an old woman out here all alone." Max, sensing the heightened tension, threw himself against his chain with renewed desperation. The stake, loosened by the rain-soaked earth and years of rust, gave another inch. Blood from his neck wound streaked his chest, but the pain only fueled his determination. As James took another step toward Meredith, Max gathered every ounce of strength remaining in his aging body and lunged forward with the power that had once made him an exemplary police K-9. The stake tore free from the ground with a wet sucking sound, 5 years of confinement ending in an instant of supreme effort. Max stumbled momentarily, disoriented by the sudden freedom, the unfamiliar sensation of movement beyond his accustomed circle. Then instinct and training took over. With the chain still attached to his collar, dragging behind him like a metallic tail, Max charged toward the confrontation, covering the distance between his stake and the intruders in seconds. His bark transformed into a deep-throated growl as he positioned himself between Meredith and James, hackles raised, teeth bared, a living barrier of fur and fierce loyalty. James's hand had just closed around his weapon when 70 pounds of determined German shepherd slammed into his legs, knocking him off balance. He fell backward into the mud, the gun skittering from his grasp. Max stood over him, growling a warning that required no translation. "Good God," Meredith breathed, watching the scene unfold with astonishment. Despite knowing Max's history as a police dog, seeing his training emerge so powerfully after years of neglect was remarkable. Ray, taking advantage of the distraction, had started to edge away toward the driveway. Max's head swiveled toward the movement, his growl communicating clearly that any further retreat would be ill-advised. With remarkable precision, the German shepherd had effectively contained both intruders without actually biting either one, a testament to his professional training. The distant wail of a siren cut through the storm's fury, growing steadily louder. Deputy Ramirez was approaching, his response time better than the dispatcher had estimated. James, still prone in the mud with Max standing guard over him, locked eyes with his accomplice. "You say one word about Wyatt being involved, and I'll make sure you never see daylight again," he hissed, just loudly enough for Ray to hear over the rain. Ray gave an almost imperceptible nod, his expression resigned. The simple robbery had become far more complicated than either had anticipated, thanks to an elderly veterinarian and a dog they had gravely underestimated. As the patrol car's lights became visible at the end of the long driveway, Meredith allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. Still holding the shotgun steady, she looked down at Max, who maintained his vigilant stance despite the rain plastering his fur to his emaciated frame, the chain still dangling from his collar like a badge of endurance overcome. "Officer Max," she said softly, with genuine respect, "reporting for duty after all these years." Max's ears twitched at her words, but his attention remained fixed on the intruders, his posture communicating that despite his age, despite the years of neglect and confinement, he remembered his purpose. He was a guardian, a protector, and for the first time in 5 long years, he was fulfilling that role without the cruel limitation of a chain. Deputy Ramirez emerged from his patrol car, hand on his service weapon as he assessed the unusual scene. An elderly woman with a shotgun, 2 mud-covered men on the ground, and a rain-soaked German shepherd standing guard, blood from his neck wounds mingling with the puddles forming around his paws. "Mrs. Wilson," he called, approaching cautiously. "Want to tell me what's going on here?" "Caught these 2 robbing the Hargrove place," Meredith replied calmly, lowering her shotgun as the officer approached. "But it was Max here who really stopped them. First time he's been off that chain in 5 years, and look what he does with his freedom." Deputy Ramirez's gaze moved to Max, noting the raw wound around his neck, the heavy chain still attached to his collar, and the steadfast way he continued to guard the subdued intruders, despite his obvious exhaustion and pain. "Well, I'll be," he said quietly. "Seems like some dogs never forget their training." He reached for his radio to call for backup, adding, "And some people never deserve the loyalty they're given." By the time the Hargrove family's sedan turned onto their long driveway early Sunday afternoon, the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of mud, scattered branches, and puddles reflecting the pale spring sunlight. What hadn't departed was the collection of vehicles still parked in front of their modest home: a sheriff's department SUV, an animal control truck, and Meredith Wilson's mud-splattered pickup. "What on earth?" Charlotte murmured, her hand instinctively reaching for Lily's arm in the back seat. Wyatt's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, his expression cycling rapidly through confusion, alarm, and finally a grim resignation that Charlotte couldn't quite interpret. He parked behind the sheriff's vehicle and turned off the engine, sitting motionless for a moment before speaking. "Wait here," he instructed, his voice unnaturally flat. "Let me find out what's going on." Before he could open his door, however, Deputy Ramirez emerged from the house, accompanied by Sheriff Thompson himself, a stocky man with a weathered face who had gone to high school with Wyatt. The presence of the sheriff, rather than just a deputy, sent a clear message about the seriousness of whatever had occurred. "I need to see Max," Lily said suddenly, unbuckling her seatbelt and pushing open her door before either parent could stop her. "Where is he?" She scanned the yard frantically, expecting to see the familiar form of her beloved dog still tethered to his stake. Instead, she spotted an empty circle of churned mud where the chain had been anchored, a sight so unexpected that she froze mid-step. "Lily, wait," Charlotte called, hurrying after her daughter while Wyatt approached the law enforcement officers with visible reluctance. Sheriff Thompson greeted Wyatt with a nod that lacked its usual warmth. "Hargrove. Good timing." "We've been trying to reach you." "Cell reception's bad at the cabin," Wyatt replied automatically. "What happened? Where's the dog?" "That's quite a story," the sheriff said, his tone carrying an undercurrent of suspicion. "Your place was broken into last night. 2 men caught in the act." Charlotte gasped, joining the conversation. "Broken in? Was anything taken?" "They had bags packed with your electronics, jewelry, some cash," Deputy Ramirez explained. "Would have gotten away with it if not for your neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, and your dog." "Max?" Lily's voice cracked with emotion. What happened to Max? Sheriff Thompson's expression softened slightly as he addressed the teenager. Your dog broke free from his chain during the confrontation, subdued one of the suspects, helped Mrs. Wilson hold them until Deputy Ramirez arrived. He paused, then added with deliberate emphasis, one of the suspects was your uncle, James Hargrove. The blood drained from Wyatt's face. Jimmy, that can't be right. It's right, came Meredith's voice as she emerged from the house, her silver hair disheveled, clothes still showing evidence of the previous night's ordeal. Your brother and his friend had quite a collection of your belongings ready to go. Would have succeeded, too, if Max hadn't raised the alarm. Where is he? Lily demanded again, looking from adult to adult with increasing desperation. Where's Max? A heavy-set man in a green uniform that identified him as County Animal Control stepped forward. The dog sustained significant injuries both from breaking free of his restraint and from years of apparent neglect. I've sedated him and taken preliminary measurements of his condition. He consulted a clipboard. Severe malnutrition, infected abrasions around the neck, untreated pneumonia, arthritis. The list goes on. Lily's eyes filled with tears. Is he going to die? We've transported him to the emergency veterinary clinic in Bozeman, the animal control officer replied, his professional demeanor softening slightly at the girl's obvious distress. He's in critical condition, but he's fighting. I need to see him, Lily insisted, turning to her mother. Mom, please. Charlotte nodded, her own eyes wet. Of course, honey. She turned to the officer. Can we go to him now? That's complicated, Sheriff Thompson interjected, his gaze hardening as it returned to Wyatt. We have some questions about the condition the dog was kept in. Under Montana law, animal neglect of this severity is a serious offense. Now wait just a minute, Wyatt began, defensive anger rising in his voice. Times have been tough, but that dog has always had shelter and water, and a chain that nearly killed him when he finally broke free, Meredith interrupted. 5 years, Wyatt. 5 years on that chain, through blizzards and heat waves with minimal food and no medical care. I've been documenting his condition for years. She patted the pocket of her jacket where her small notebook contained detailed observations. Just in case a day like this ever came. Wyatt stared at his elderly neighbor, realization dawning that she had been watching, taking notes, building a case all this time. You had no right, he said through clenched teeth. She had every right, Charlotte said unexpectedly, her voice stronger than it had been in years. And so did Max. He saved our home, Wyatt, even after everything. Deputy Ramirez cleared his throat. There's something else you should know, Mr. Hargrove. Your brother James has made some interesting statements during questioning. Claims this was an insurance scam you helped orchestrate. Says you knew about the break-in, planned to file an inflated claim. Wyatt's face contorted, panic flashing in his eyes before he managed to compose himself. That's ridiculous. Jimmy's trying to save his own skin. You know his record, Sheriff. He's a pathological liar. Sheriff Thompson studied his former classmate with the measured gaze of someone who had spent decades separating truth from lies. Maybe so. But we found your family's overnight bag still packed in the car, light for a weekend trip. And your sister-in-law says she never invited you to use her cabin this weekend. Doesn't look good, Wyatt. Charlotte's shocked gasp cut through the tense silence that followed. You planned this? You knew they were coming? The betrayal in her voice was palpable as pieces fell into place. Wyatt's sudden enthusiasm for a family trip, his uncharacteristic willingness to leave precisely when the storm would be at its worst. It wasn't like that, Wyatt protested, but the conviction had drained from his voice. Jimmy said they'd just take a few things, nothing sentimental, nothing irreplaceable. The insurance would have covered it all, given us a fresh start. While Max stayed chained outside in the worst storm of the season, Lily said, her young face hardening with a disgust beyond her years. You left him here to die. The accusation hung in the air, impossible to deny. Wyatt's shoulders slumped in defeat as Sheriff Thompson stepped forward, his expression grim but resolute. Wyatt Hargrove, I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit insurance fraud and criminal animal neglect. As he recited the Miranda rights, Wyatt offered no resistance, the fight gone out of him entirely. Charlotte, standing with her arm around Lily's shaking shoulders, watched her husband being handcuffed with a strange sense of detachment. For years, she had made excuses for his behavior, normalized his increasing cruelty, convinced herself that things would improve. Now, as he was led to the sheriff's vehicle, she felt an unexpected lightness, as if a chain around her own neck had finally broken. "Mom," Lily's voice pulled her back to the moment, urgent and determined. "We need to go to Max, now." Meredith stepped forward, car keys already in hand. "I'll drive you. Know the clinic well. Was my place of work for many years." As they moved toward Meredith's truck, the animal control officer called after them. "You should prepare yourselves. His injuries are severe, and given his age and condition, well, the veterinarians will do everything they can, but you should be ready for difficult decisions." Lily's face crumpled at this, but Charlotte drew her daughter close. "Max has survived 5 years of hell because he had something to live for," she said firmly. "Let's make sure he knows we're still worth fighting for." The Bozeman Veterinary Emergency Clinic occupied a modern single-story building on the outskirts of the city, its red emergency sign glowing steadily against the afternoon sky. Meredith parked her truck in the nearly empty lot, cutting the engine with practiced efficiency. "They've likely sedated him heavily," she explained as they hurried toward the entrance. "Standard procedure for trauma cases, especially with a dog in his condition." The reception area was sterile and quiet, the antiseptic smell reminiscent of human hospitals. A young woman in blue scrubs looked up from her computer as they approached the desk, her expression professionally neutral. "We're here about Max," Charlotte said, her voice tight with worry. "The German Shepherd brought in from Clearwater County this morning." Recognition flickered across the receptionist's face. "The police dog," she said, reaching for her phone. "I'll let Dr. Abernathy know you're here." "Police dog?" Lily questioned, turning to Meredith with confusion. The older woman nodded, settling into one of the waiting room chairs with a sigh that spoke of her exhaustion after the night's events. "I was going to tell you eventually. Found his old tags years ago, K-9 unit, Montana State Police. Your father knew, I suspect. Must have gotten Max after he was retired from service." Before Lily could respond, a door opened and a tall woman in a white coat emerged. Dr. Abernathy's dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, her expression grave but not unkind as she approached. "You're Max's family?" she asked, extending her hand first to Charlotte, then to Lily. "Yes," Lily answered immediately, while Charlotte hesitated almost imperceptibly before nodding. After years of relegating Max to the status of outdoor guardian rather than family member, claiming him now felt disingenuous. Yet Lily's certainty was contagious, and Charlotte found herself adding, "How is he?" Dr. Abernathy gestured toward a small consultation room off the main waiting area. "Let's talk privately," she suggested, a phrase that sent a chill through both mother and daughter. Once seated in the small room, the veterinarian consulted the tablet in her hands. "Max is currently stable but in serious condition," she began, her tone direct but compassionate. "The wounds around his neck required extensive cleaning and suturing. He's severely malnourished and dehydrated. Blood work shows anemia, elevated liver enzymes, and evidence of chronic infection." Each item on the list felt like an indictment to Charlotte, a catalog of her family's failure to care for a creature who had depended on them entirely. Beside her, Lily's hand tightened around her own. "The most immediate concern," Dr. Abernathy continued, "is the pneumonia, which has progressed to a significant infection in both lungs. We've started him on broad-spectrum antibiotics and IV fluids, but at his age and in his weakened state, his recovery is far from certain." "His age?" Charlotte questioned. "We've had him for 7 years, but he was already an adult when he came to us. How old would you estimate he is?" "Based on dentition and other markers, I'd place him around 9 or 10, the veterinarian replied. "Which brings me to something interesting we discovered during his examination." She tapped her tablet, bringing up an image of what appeared to be a small electronic chip. "Max is microchipped, which is standard for service animals. The chip contains his official identification number with the Montana State Police K-9 unit." "So he really was a police dog," Lily whispered, a mixture of pride and sadness coloring her voice. Dr. Abernathy nodded. "According to the information in the database, Max, or K-9 Officer Max, number 457 as he was officially designated, served for 3 years with the Highway Patrol Division, specializing in narcotics detection and suspect apprehension. He was retired after sustaining injuries during a pursuit." "What kind of injuries?" Charlotte asked. "The record mentions a spinal injury and hip dysplasia," the veterinarian explained. "Not uncommon in working German shepherds, particularly those involved in physically demanding tasks. These conditions would have made it impossible for him to continue service work, but shouldn't have prevented him from living a comfortable life as a pet." The implication hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Max should have received special care for his service-related injuries, not neglect that exacerbated them. "I've taken the liberty of contacting his former handler," Dr. Abernathy continued, consulting her notes. "Officer Michael Reeves, now a sergeant with the state police. He was quite surprised to learn Max was still alive. According to him, Max was adopted through the department's retirement program by a family who specifically stated they understood his medical needs." Charlotte felt a wave of nausea as realization dawned. "Wyatt never mentioned any of this," she said quietly. "He told us Max had washed out of police training due to a leg injury. We had no idea he was a retired officer with medical conditions." Dr. Abernathy's expression softened slightly at this. "That explains some things. Sergeant Reeves was particularly concerned because the department provided a stipend for Max's ongoing medical care as part of the adoption agreement, funds that were disbursed annually for the first 3 years of his retirement." "Money for Max's care?" Lily's voice rose in disbelief. "But Dad never took him to a vet, not once." Meredith, who had been silent until now, spoke from the doorway where she had been listening. "That explains why Wyatt was so opposed when I suggested veterinary care. He'd been pocketing the stipend meant for Max's treatment." The room fell silent as the full picture of Wyatt's deception became clear. Not only had he chained Max outside and neglected his basic needs, but he had actively profited from funds intended for the dog's medical care, all while keeping Max's service history secret from his own family. After a moment, Dr. Abernathy cleared her throat gently. "There's one more thing you should know. Sergeant Reeves is on his way here. He said he needed to see Max one more time, regardless of the outcome." "Can we see him too?" Lily asked, her voice small but determined. "Please?" The veterinarian hesitated. "He's heavily sedated and connected to various monitoring equipment." "It might be upsetting for you." "More upsetting than imagining him suffering alone?" Lily challenged, a strength beyond her 15 years evident in her steady gaze. "He needs to know we're here, that we didn't abandon him again." Dr. Abernathy studied the teenager's face for a moment before nodding. "Very well, but just for a few minutes, and you'll need to be very quiet and gentle." She led them through a series of doors into the treatment area of the clinic. The room was dimly lit and humming with the soft sounds of monitoring equipment. In the center, on a padded table covered with warming blankets, lay Max. Charlotte gasped softly at the sight. Without his thick fur to disguise the reality of his condition, Max's emaciation was shockingly apparent, each rib visible, his once powerful frame reduced to a shadow of itself. An IV line ran into his foreleg, delivering fluids and medication. His neck was heavily bandaged where the chain had torn into his flesh, and an oxygen tube assisted his labored breathing. Yet despite his weakened state, there was still something dignified in the way he lay, something that spoke of the proud service animal he had once been. Lily approached slowly, tears streaming silently down her face. With infinite gentleness, she placed her hand on an uninjured portion of Max's side, feeling the shallow rise and fall of his breathing. "I'm so sorry, Max," she whispered. "I didn't know. I should have done more." To everyone's surprise, Max's eyes flickered open at the sound of her voice, unfocused and clouded with pain medication, but undeniably responsive. With tremendous effort, his tail moved in the faintest suggestion of a wag. Dr. Abernathy checked the monitors, her expression revealing professional surprise. "He recognizes your voice," she said quietly. "That's a good sign." Dogs who have something, or someone, to live for often defy medical odds. Charlotte moved to stand beside her daughter, placing her own hand hesitantly on Max's head, stroking the space between his ears with tentative affection. "We're here now, Max," she said, her voice breaking, "and we're not leaving you again." The dog's eyes drifted closed once more, the brief moment of consciousness exhausting his limited reserves, but his tail continued its almost imperceptible movement against the blanket. As they stood vigil beside the injured animal, the clinic door opened, and a tall man in a state police uniform entered, his hat held respectfully in his hands. Sergeant Michael Reeves was in his early 40s, with the lean, alert build of someone who spent his life in active service. His expression as he approached Max's bedside was one of profound sadness mingled with barely contained anger. "I was told this was Max number 457, he said, his voice tight with emotion. "But I almost didn't recognize him." "You were his handler?" Charlotte asked, noting the way the man's eyes never left the dog's face. Reeves nodded, reaching out to touch Max's muzzle with the familiarity of someone who had once trusted this animal with his life. 3 years. Best partner I ever had." His gaze finally shifted to Charlotte, then Lily. The department was assured he was going to a loving home with people who understood what these dogs give in service, who promised to honor that sacrifice with proper care. The accusation in his tone was unmistakable, and Charlotte found she couldn't meet his eyes. "It wasn't them," Meredith interjected from where she stood near the door. "Her husband kept Max's history from them, took the stipend money for himself." Sergeant Reeves' expression hardened further. "I'll be adding my statement to the charges against him, then." "Fraud, at minimum." He returned his attention to Max, his professional demeanor momentarily cracking as he gently stroked the dog's ear in a practiced gesture. "Hey, old partner. Hang in there. Still got work to do, you hear me?" To everyone's astonishment, Max's ear twitched at the familiar command voice, and his eyes opened once more, struggling to focus on the face of his former handler. 3 weeks later, the Hargrove home stood quiet in the gentle warmth of early summer, its appearance subtly transformed. The unkempt yard had been mowed, flower beds cleared of weeds and replanted with colorful annuals. The chain and stake that had defined Max's existence for 5 years were gone, the circle of bare earth now covered with fresh sod, a deliberate erasure of a painful past. Inside, more profound changes had taken place. Wyatt's presence was notably absent, his personal belongings packed away in boxes stacked in the garage. After his arrest, he had been denied bail due to the fraud charges and his connection to James, whose extensive criminal record and flight risk status had influenced the judge's decision regarding both brothers. Charlotte moved through the kitchen with a newfound energy, preparing a pot of coffee for herself and Meredith, who sat at the table reviewing paperwork spread before her. The older woman had become a daily visitor, her expertise and support proving invaluable during the upheaval of recent weeks. The insurance company has agreed to honor your claim for the items that were actually taken from the house, Meredith explained, tapping a document with her pen. Since you had no knowledge of Wyatt's involvement in the scheme, it's not a large settlement, but it should help with immediate expenses. Charlotte nodded gratefully. The diner owner increased my hours to full time, and 3 of my regular customers turned out to be lawyers. They're helping me file for divorce pro bono. She poured coffee into 2 mugs, adding cream to Meredith's as she'd learned the older woman preferred. I never thought I'd have the courage to leave him, even after everything. Funny how nearly losing Max was what finally pushed me to save myself. Not funny at all, Meredith replied, accepting the coffee with a nod of thanks. Sometimes we can do for others what we can't do for ourselves, especially for those who depend on us entirely. She glanced toward the living room where the subject of their conversation could be seen through the doorway. Speaking of which, how's our patient today? Charlotte's expression softened. Getting stronger. The antibiotics finally cleared the pneumonia and he's gained nearly 5 pounds. Dr. Abernathy says his blood work is showing improvement. In the living room, Max lay on a thick orthopedic dog bed positioned near a sunny window, a far cry from the weathered doghouse that had been his shelter for so long. His coat, though still thin in places, had been carefully washed and brushed to a soft sheen. The raw wounds around his neck had healed to pink scars partially hidden by new fur growth. Beside him sat Lily, reading aloud from one of her school books, her free hand absently stroking his head. The road to recovery had been neither quick nor easy. After that first critical night at the emergency clinic, Max had spent 10 days as an inpatient, fighting the infection that had threatened to overcome his weakened system. When he was finally stable enough for discharge, the question of where he would go had been raised. Given the pending animal neglect charges, returning him to the Hargrove property was legally complicated. It was Sergeant Reeves who had provided the solution, invoking a rarely used provision in the K-9 retirement program that allowed former service dogs to be reclaimed by the department in cases of mistreatment. Officially, Max was once again the property of the Montana State Police, but with a special fostering arrangement that permitted him to stay with Charlotte and Lily while Wyatt's case proceeded through the legal system. The department will cover all his medical expenses, Reeves had explained when presenting the arrangement. And at the conclusion of the legal proceedings, assuming the court terminates Wyatt's ownership rights, you'll have the first option to adopt him permanently. The sergeant had paused, fixing Charlotte with an evaluating gaze. Provided you can demonstrate he'll be properly cared for this time. The implied judgment had stung, but Charlotte accepted it as fair. She had been complicit in Max's neglect through her silence, through her failure to challenge Wyatt's treatment of the dog even when she knew it was wrong. This second chance was more than she deserved, and she was determined not to waste it. The sound of tires on gravel announced a visitor, and Lily looked up from her reading. "That's probably Sergeant Reeves," she said, carefully marking her place in the book. "He said he'd come by today to check on Max." The relationship between the police officer and the Hargrove women had evolved from tense to cordial over the weeks since Max's injury. Reeves visited regularly, bringing specialized food supplements for Max and, more importantly, sharing stories of the dog's service years that helped Lily and Charlotte understand the remarkable animal who had been living unrecognized among them. He once tracked a missing child through 5 miles of forest during a thunderstorm, Reeves had told them during a recent visit, his pride in his former partner evident. Found her huddled under a fallen tree, hypothermic but alive. The department gave him a commendation, had his photo in the papers and everything. These stories had transformed Max in their eyes, not that they needed additional reasons to care for him, but understanding his past somehow made his loyalty despite mistreatment even more extraordinary. Here was a dog who had been a decorated officer, who had saved lives and served with distinction, reduced to an alarm system on a chain, yet who had still given everything to protect the family who had abandoned him to that fate. Charlotte rose to answer the door, but instead of Sergeant Reeves, she found a young woman in a business suit holding a leather portfolio. "Mrs. Hargrove, I'm Jessica Townsend from the county prosecutor's office." The woman offered her hand. "I was hoping to speak with you about your husband's case, if you have a moment." Charlotte invited her in, directing her to the kitchen where Meredith still sat with the insurance paperwork. After introductions and offers of coffee, politely declined, Jessica opened her portfolio and got directly to the point. "I'll be frank, Mrs. Hargrove. Your husband is facing serious charges: insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, and felony animal cruelty. His brother James has an extensive record and is looking at a potential third strike, which carries a mandatory lengthy sentence." She withdrew several documents, placing them on the table. "James has offered to testify that Wyatt was the mastermind behind the insurance scam, claiming he was manipulated due to his own gambling debts. Wyatt, meanwhile, insists it was entirely James's idea, which he reluctantly went along with out of family loyalty." "And you're trying to determine which of them is lying," Charlotte surmised. Jessica nodded. "Exactly. Which is why I'm here. Your testimony regarding Wyatt's behavior leading up to that weekend could be crucial. And—" She hesitated, glancing toward the living room where Max could be seen resting beside Lily. "We'd like to bring the dog's condition into evidence as well, to establish a pattern of deception and callousness that supports our case regarding the insurance fraud." Charlotte considered this, her gaze following the prosecutors to rest on Max. The German Shepherd had given so much, endured so much. Using his suffering to ensure justice seemed both appropriate and somehow healing, a way to give meaning to years of silent pain. "I'll testify," she said firmly, "and I'll bring Max's veterinary records, photos, everything. It's time the truth was fully known." Friends, take a moment to reflect on Max's story. A decorated police K-9 who, despite being chained outside for 5 long years through brutal Montana winters, still chose to protect the very family who had forgotten him. When those burglars came in the night, Max could have remained silent. Instead, he broke free from his chains, literally tearing his own flesh to stand guard over what mattered. How many of us have felt cast aside as we've grown older? How many have wondered if our lifetime of service to our families, our communities, our nation has been forgotten? Max reminds us that true character isn't diminished by age or circumstance. His story speaks to something we all understand: the dignity of loyalty that persists even when it's undeserved. In our twilight years, we've seen enough of life to know that second chances are precious gifts, not guarantees. Charlotte and Lily found theirs by finally recognizing the silent hero in their midst. Perhaps we too might look around and notice the overlooked guardians in our own lives, or recognize that despite our years or limitations, we still have purpose, still have value, still have love to give that transcends whatever chains life may have placed upon us.